So July 4th rolled around again. Everyone did pretty much what I expected them to do. Normal people went to see the fireworks, had barbecues, went to the movies, used it as an excuse to binge drink. In the blogosphere and Twitter, conservatives peddled jingoistic sentiments and reiterated their support for the White House and the military, and those of left sympathies took the opportunity to rail against historic injustices and American militarism again, complete with the amusing spectacle of actually purchasing American flags, probably from some company that uses slaves in Bangladesh to manufacture them, just to film themselves burning it to impress the middle-class false consciousness that considers that subversive. All in all, everyone stuck to the script.
Guys, this is Will Witt from PragerU. Today we're on Santa Monica Beach and we're going to be asking people some questions for the 4th of July.
I personally did celebrate the occasion, but not for the same reasons as most people. Coincidentally, there are two revolutions in American history that commenced on the 4th day in the 7th month of the year, one in 1776 and the other in 1863. The day Union troops turned the tide of the Civil War at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, essentially signing the death warrant for the Confederacy. There's a reason American volunteers in Spain 70 years later called themselves the Lincoln Battalion. In official bourgeois historiography, the American War of Independence created the system of liberal representative democracy that endures to this day. In reality, it was really the Civil War, the Union's victory in said war specifically, that established what we would recognize as a modern liberal bourgeois democratic state. Supporters of the Confederacy have taken to calling it the War of Northern Aggression. In a similar manner, I think it would be best described as the American National Revolutionary War. As one participant at the Anti-Slavery Women's Loyal National League in 1863 put it, "I am from Germany, where my brothers all fought against the government and tried to make us free, but were unsuccessful. We foreigners know the preciousness of that great, noble gift a great deal better than you, because you were never in slavery, but we are born in it." Everyone who experienced it has been dead for decades, but the American Civil War has refused to vacate itself from the national consciousness of this country since it began. That much isn't surprising. The Civil War killed more Americans than almost every other war we've been in combined. Specifically, it killed about 600,000 people, split roughly in half for each side, or around 2% of the country's total population of the time, which would be about 6 million people today. What is surprising is that most people have an extremely limited understanding of it. The national debate about the Civil War pretty much exclusively revolves around the role of slavery, with one side reporting a heavily romanticized portrayal of the Confederacy as defenders of a vaguely defined ethos of culture and/or Lockean opposition to governmental overreach, and the other side responding in kind with empirical evidence to demonstrate otherwise. But the problem with this historiography is that it isn't so much about acquiring greater knowledge of historical record, but rather it's merely another front line in the battle of very modern political grievances. Liberals and progressives take offense to statues of Confederate officials, so conservatives reflexively organize to preserve said monuments and present a narrative downplaying slavery, and progressives reflexively challenge their rivals' alleged chronicle. One side takes a stand on an issue, so we must adopt the opposite. Let me make it perfectly clear that I'm not taking some sort of centrist or both sides position on this issue. Yes, the Civil War was about slavery. Anyone who purports otherwise is either a liar or an idiot, but I feel like leaving it at that description seriously understates the totality with which this conflict fundamentally reshaped this country, which I will attempt to reveal thusly. To understand this, you have to understand why American colonists rebelled against the British in the first place and what post-colonial America was. Ideological factors like Jeffersonian democracy and civic nationalism were really not an important factor. We very nearly were a monarchy. The primary motivations were the material interests of the colonial upper classes, one of the bigger ones being a desire to expand westward on the continent, which the British had forbade them from. There were genuinely emancipatory and arguably even proto-socialist sentiments and movements in colonial America, but the War of Independence was not one of them. It was an action by the colonial elite to channel that energy against British rule exclusively. So while it maybe had vaguely Republican trappings, the American War of Independence is really best understood as another of the innumerable conflicts between rival aspiring rulers with little relevance to most of the population beyond misery, in a similar vein to the Carlist Wars or the French Wars of Religion. If you're the generous type, the War of Independence maybe could be described as a preliminary to the French Revolution, which is really more where the ideas of republicanism and democracy as we know them today come from. Before 1860, we had more in common with the Roman Republic, which is what our Constitution was modeled off of, than anything that resembles democracy. with a slave-owning aristocracy at the top, petty smallholders below them, and, of course, the slaves. Imagine if for some reason the revolution only applied to some of the population who were free to go down the path of historical development, but a fairly sizable percentage were still serfs. That's basically where we were. Southerners and pro-slavery politicians had dominated the federal government for decades. Interestingly, there was no rhetoric about states' rights during this period, so it must have been quite a shock when a candidate from only a 6-year-old Republican Party with socialist and radical abolitionists among its members, as hard as that may be to believe today, won the presidency with a large plurality. It certainly alarmed Wall Street, with various stocks plummeting and business interests contributing to an anti-Republican fusion ticket. The primary root of the Civil War is the emergence of the American working class. The first stage of the Industrial Revolution in America in the wake of the War of 1812 created a huge demand for cotton to supply the textile industry. This destroyed any of the initial hopes that slavery might be quarantined to a few of the original states or simply legislated out of existence. The nature of American slavery meant that land was increasingly concentrated into the hands of large plantation owners, forcing artisans and smallholders into the factories alongside massive numbers of immigrants from Europe. For obvious reasons, wage workers, or free labor as it was called at the time, did not support slavery. And as we gained more and more land on the continent, buying it or conquering it from Indians or Mexico, pro- and anti-slavery America began a race to shape the new territories in their image, which often resulted in violent confrontations, Bleeding Kansas being the most famous case. Immigrants and people eager to escape the landlords and the poverty of urban slums wanted their own personal small plots of land in those areas, and there were attempts to get government legislation passed that would grant it to them, but they were always averted by Southern Democrats who needed large swaths of the area open to purchase by slave owners. After the Southern states seceded, it finally became a reality, with Lincoln signing the Homestead Act into law in 1862, one of the most progressive and radical land reform measures in history, even if it didn't benefit African Americans as much as it should have. It meant that a former slave, an impoverished factory worker, a serf from Tsarist Russia, an Irish refugee, or even a single mother could have their own land. This also indirectly helped industrial workers because it forced factory owners to grant greater concessions, lest their employees get sick of their situation and decide to simply pack up and attempt to make a life in the frontier, complete with government assistance to only make it more appealing. Indeed, the situation of an American factory worker was liberal in comparison to their European counterparts. Undoubtedly, this effect was a major factor in the subsequent successes of the labor movement, many of which transpired in the immediate years after the war's end. So somewhat paradoxically, the Civil War was simultaneously about resistance to proletarianization and defending the interest of wage workers. Only a month later, Lincoln signed the Railroad Act into law, which, as its name implies, facilitated the large-scale creation of railroads across the territory. It was also blocked by pro-slavery politicians in previous years. The role developments of the productive forces like this had in the creation of the modern nation-state and capitalism is often understated. They greatly facilitated the expansion of markets and the movement of peoples. Before the transportation revolution, a country wasn't so much a thing you lived in. For most people, it was just a vague irrelevance, a government in a distant capital that just claimed you lived in its territory, but with little, if any, effective meaning. Before the war, most Americans had never traveled more than 20 miles from their homes. For the Confederacy, with cotton harvest being the heart, but by no means the entirety, as is sometimes implied, of the institution, expanding slavery geographically was essential to maintaining their livelihood, because the plantations were literally exhausting the land. In fact, it could be argued that the Civil War was an early example of climate change affecting politics, which is not a comforting thought in an age of rapidly rising global temperatures. Plans were made to expand slavery into the western frontier, Mexico, South America, and Cuba. The Confederacy also had the support of the ruling class of the British Empire. Plantation owners made enormous profits selling cotton to English textile barons. Had the Confederates gotten their way and somehow won the war, the independent South would have been an economically stunted banana republic for European empires in the same way Central America was in the early 20th century. We nearly went to war with the British after the Union Navy arrested 2 diplomats and to discuss with the South. Some of the many unsung heroes of the Civil War are the British workers and trade unionists who at great personal sacrifice obstructed the ruling class's plans to intervene in the war in favor of the Confederacy through mass demonstrations. Lincoln, a moderate in the party, despite his personal moral objections, infamously started seeking merely to preserve the Union. He was very apprehensive about risking drawing the ire of the border states, who were slave states but didn't secede, and often acted hesitantly in half measures. Ending slavery became an objective after it became clear that the support of slaves was paramount to the war effort, and he was pressured by the left of the Republican Party and Union leadership, giving the war a now revolutionary character. Lincoln offered Giuseppe Garibaldi, the radical Republican hero of Italy's Unification War, a conflict with numerous parallels to the Civil War, funnily enough, and a legendary military command of the Union Army. He told Lincoln he would accept the offer on one condition: the abolition of slavery had to be made a goal of the war. Of course, Lincoln eventually did just that, but as fate would have it, Garibaldi did not end up joining the Union Army, but Lincoln did manage to recruit many of his followers. The task of recruiting soldiers often fell on citizens, who would raise their own regiments by touring their communities, convincing their neighbors to join them, and subsequently present themselves to the army. Immigrants played a critical role, representing roughly a quarter of the Federal Army. Among them were several thousand veterans of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, many of whom occupied high-ranking positions in the Union Army, like August Willich, who resigned from the Prussian army for his Republican sentiments, became a carpenter, joined the Communist League, commanded a Freikorps in the Baden-Palatinate uprising, edited a socialist newspaper in Cincinnati, and planned to kill Karl Marx in a duel for the crime of being too conservative. They made him a general. He trained the 9th Ohio Infantry, a regiment composed almost entirely of Germans, with a handful of Swiss, French, and Russians thrown in for good measure, who sang revolutionary songs into battle and kept kegs of beer, in spite of Sherman's ban on alcohol in the army. The 9th earned fame after a successful bayonet charge that ended the rebel offensive at Mill Springs, an important battle in Kentucky, and another one later at Chickamauga that resulted in the capture of an enemy artillery battery. Willich later became the colonel of the 32nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment, also a German radical unit. He was regarded by many of his contemporaries as one of the better Union officers of the war due to his popularity with his men and his innovative tactics inspired by his experiences in the Prussian military, including an alternative infantry formation called advanced firing. At Rowlett Station, a detachment of about 500 members of the 32nd were attacked by a rebel force almost 3 times as large. They repulsed the repeated assaults, killing 33 rebels, including a colonel, and wounding 50. The 32nd lost 13 and had 28 wounded. Willich had the regimental band play La Marseillaise at the Battle of Shiloh, after which he was given command of the Dutch Brigade, which the 32nd was a part of. The 32nd also fought at the Siege of Chattanooga, Sherman's Atlanta campaign, and countered Confederate guerrillas in Kentucky. After the war, and sustaining his fair share of injuries, Willich led a quiet life as a civil servant in his native Germany before returning to the United States, where he passed away in 1878 at 67 years of age. Oh, and he also apparently might have been gay. Other noteworthy radical U.S. Army leaders include Joseph Adamer, a lieutenant colonel who commanded a Missouri artillery regiment and later the 41st Volunteer Infantry, who were assigned garrison of St. Louis. He was a communist who became a labor organizer, a journalist who wrote some pretty good articles, and a participant in both of Lincoln's election campaigns. After the war, he agitated for civil rights for freedmen and became a county auditor in St. Louis, where he worked to collect unpaid taxes of war profiteers until his death only a year after the war. Alexander Schimmelpfennig, member of the Communist League who commanded the 74th Pennsylvania Infantry, the mostly German 74th unfortunately became the target of nativist sentiments of the time. They were blamed for the disaster at Chancellorsville, where the 11th Corps, which the 74th was a part of, retreated en masse after being flanked by rebels. In reality, the Germans offered the stiffest resistance to Jackson's troops. Schimmelpfennig had the honor of accepting Charleston's surrender in February of 1865. Alexander Asboth, a Hungarian revolutionary who led a 700-strong column of mounted infantry, which included former slaves, in a raid against the rebel-held town of Pensacola, Florida, during which he was shot in the arm. Fritz Anecki, a socialist newspaper editor who commanded the 34th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, after exposing the incompetence of some of his superior officers, he was blackmailed and subsequently dishonorably discharged. His wife was a feminist activist and a friend of Susan B. Anthony. Friedrich Hecker, he commanded the 24th Illinois Volunteers, made up of German, Hungarian, Czech, and Slovak immigrants, most of them 1848 veterans themselves. The 24th were assigned to rearguard duties early in the war, but later went on to fight in Perryville, Stones River, Chickamauga, Tullahoma, Missionary Ridge, and Atlanta. Hecker later commanded the 82nd Illinois Volunteers, in which Germans made 2/3, and the remaining third made up mostly of various nationalities, including one company consisting entirely of European Jews. They participated in several battles, including Gettysburg and Sherman's March. Immigrants also fought in large numbers in the rank and file. Edwin de Leon, a Confederate diplomat, described the U.S. Army as being made up of the famished revolutionaries and malcontents of Germany, all the Red Republicans, and almost all the Irish emigrants. In addition to the aforementioned 9th, 32nd, 74th, 24th, and 82nd Regiments, there was the famous Irish Brigade, who fought in almost every major battle and suffered among the highest casualties of any brigade of the war. One of its regiments was led by Michael Corcoran, a veteran of Ireland's 1848 rebellion, who refused to march the regiment in a parade in honor of the visiting Prince of Wales. The 39th New York Volunteer Infantry, or the Garibaldi Guard as it was popularly known, an extremely diverse regiment consisting of 3 German companies, 3 Hungarian companies, 1 Italian, 1 Swiss, 1 French, 1 Spanish, and 1 Portuguese, and also included a handful of women as vivandières. The Guard participated in some pretty brutal battles and also had to deal with a corrupt colonel. The Spinola Empire Brigade, named after its initial commander, consisting of 4 mainly Italian regiments. Interestingly, there were several Zouave units in the U.S. Army, which was a type of elite light infantry unit in colonial North Africa. They emulated the aesthetics, drill, and tactics of their namesake, which involved mobility and open order formations. They wore a variety of flashy and colorful uniforms, often prominently featuring red, evoking the spirit and imagery of European revolutionaries. There were about 70 Zouave regiments in the Union Army, most well known being the 11th New York, composed of that city's firefighters. With so many socialists in the Republican Party, it's possible the U.S. could have gone down a very different path had the radical faction triumphed. However, the war created a huge economic boom for northern industrialists, the shoddy aristocracy, referring to the poor quality and overpriced equipment they sold to the government. In 1860, there were 10 millionaires in New York City. By the end of the war, there were more than 100. Business interests quickly took control of the party, setting the stage for the political duality that lingers to this day. This ushered in the second stage of the Industrial Revolution in America and the horrors of the Gilded Age. The emancipation of slaves was, of course, also heavily undermined through Jim Crow laws and violence. The Homestead Act was very much a response from Americans to the misery of early capitalism, but the mistake we made was believing in widespread individual private ownership instead of socialization of the means of production. However, the Civil War was still very much a net gain for the masses. It ended chattel slavery, ushered in land reform, built railroads, led to important labor reforms, guaranteed citizenship to anyone born here, and kick-started our massive industrial base, all of which would be unthinkable to not have today. It was a war to modernize this country, fought and won by workers, farmers, freedmen, immigrants, and revolutionaries against the patricians' revolt, and it should be celebrated as an important victory, not just in this country, but around the world, and any lost causer who tries to convince you otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about.